I appreciate everybody coming out today to listen to my perspective on climate change. I'm sure everybody has one. I basically spent my life in the back room, so public speaking is a bit new to me and a bit late in life. It says here that I was Deputy Minister to the Premier, but before that I was Secretary of the Cabinet Planning Committee. And in that role, and subsequently in the cabinet room, that's where you get to see how the politicians actually make their policies, what goes into it, what shouldn't go into it, and those kinds of things. That's primarily where I'm coming from here as someone who is interested in public policy. I'm not a scientist, and I don't pretend to understand the science in any great detail. There's lots of people that can speak to that better than I can. But I know enough to know that you can't ignore it and expect to come up with a public policy on an item that's as important as climate change is, unless, if you don't do that, you're going to make some horrendous mistakes. And it's my opinion that our current governments across the country, certainly at the national level, don't have the full picture they need to be fair to us and to be efficient in what they do. Let me tell you how I got started. Back in late 2015, the Premier of Alberta announced her climate leadership plan, and I took the time to read it, study it, and my first impression of it was I couldn't understand how you could develop a plan that had so many huge important pieces missing and call it a plan. You could have called it a committee report, which it was, but not a plan. So I wrote my first column that was published in the Calgary Herald and essentially criticized what I thought was a ham-fisted approach to spending billions of dollars to shut down our coal plants prematurely. For the simple sake of the optics of lowering our carbon footprint. Not long after that, our federal government announced that it was moving along on lowering emissions, and they were going to use the method of a national carbon tax to do that. So it became increasingly apparent to me that they were only working with half the carbon cycle. And so I wrote a column which was published in the Financial Post. That piece took off. It struck a nerve with a lot of people, became the most popular article of the year in the social media, which I don't use. Before that, I wasn't sure that 80 people agreed with me, let alone 80,000. So my purpose here today is not to provide you with answers, but to get you to think, to question, to analyze, and hopefully demand action of your leaders on this important issue. Try to be fair to everybody. When I'm done, I hope to have covered our lack of science in the current climate policy, Canada's potential to absorb carbon dioxide and what opportunities that provides for us. I want to compare Canada to the big player in this, and that's China. And then I would like to make some recommendations for what I think are real and positive contributions that Canada can make to this issue. So, what is the current state of affairs? Well, let's look quickly at the Canadian and Alberta climate file. After 20 years after Kyoto, we still haven't completed the full carbon cycle science. No one can tell you today what Canada's baseline is. And you can't develop effective, efficient policy, or you can't even know what effective and efficient policy is unless you have that baseline. Okay? And our governments are implementing policy anyway. Costly policies. You know, our Prime Minister made some unfortunate statements of a while back of phasing out the oil sands. It's not helpful. We get from NGOs and environmental groups labels like Fossil of the Year or Corrupt Petrostate, and even fairly reputable organizations like the Conference Board of Canada give Alberta a D-, along with Saskatchewan, on climate status, and they give Quebec an A. Obviously, we get the oil and they get the hydro. Now let's look at the rationale that they give us for their policy decisions or their positions. Canada must honor its Paris commitments. And Canada is a large per capita emitter, standard one. So we have to reduce. Canada needs to be seen as a global leader. It's the optics, something for our national psyche. Canada is prosperous and we must do more. I think you can notice from those kinds of things that none of them are rooted in science. There's an avoidance of the science here. They're subjective supposed tos, driven by our emotional. Now, most Canadians, I think, would agree that our response to climate change, and we should make one, needs to be scientifically sound, environmentally sustainable, financially realistic, and comprehensive as well as effective. Right now, the Canadian government's approach is based on a one-sided obsession with emissions. They are completely ignoring the other side of that cycle, which is absorption. So let me ask you, is Canada even a net carbon dioxide emitter? If you take into account what we absorb against what we emit, what's your answer? To get some insight into that question, you have to go outside of the country. You have to leave Canada. And I went to the Global Carbon Project and I used the 2015 report. If you look where you see total there, that's human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide average over the 10 years for the world at 37.6 billion tons. Of that amount, the land absorbed 11.5 billion tons, the water 9.7, and 16.4 stayed in the air. Now, the amount that stayed in the air accumulated over time since the industrialization has driven our CO2 content in the atmosphere from 280 parts to 400 parts per million, and raised our climate temperature, Earth temperature 1 degree by consensus around science. The objective of Paris is to try to keep that number under 2, and therefore to keep our amount under probably in the range of 500 parts per million from the curve. Now, I give you a little number on the bottom that I calculated just to try to give you something that you can relate to when we come back to the land. It says the number that went back to the land, if you simply divide that number by the total land area of the planet, you get 77 tons per square kilometer. I didn't take the time to try to put that into sections, but you get the idea. So if you look at what I have here, then based on the averages using an average from the Global Carbon Project, Canada's land mass means that we're likely absorbing more carbon dioxide than we emit, which sort of stands to reason. If you look at the size of the country, the few people we have, I mean, intuitively, we all kind of think that might be the case. Meanwhile, the big four emitters, which are China, the US, the European Union, and India, are responsible for 60% of the total emissions on the planet. And if you use that same calculation, about 10 times what their combined land area could absorb. So urbanized, overpopulated nations around in Europe and Asia and the Middle East can't make a meaningful contribution to absorption. but a vast country like Canada certainly can. We should measure it. It's meaningful. Unfortunately, that's not what we're doing. We're signing agreements that give that away. Don't even consider it. Now, you'll often hear our Prime Minister and Federal Minister of the Environment state that our action is necessary to meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement. But Canada's problematic approach in the Paris Agreement goes back a lot further, as Dwayne has mentioned earlier. Goes back to the 90s with Kyoto, where Canada, Russia, Australia, Japan, and a few others actually argued that natural absorption of carbon dioxide should be included in the agreements, into the Kyoto Protocol. Okay. That failure of Kyoto has haunted us ever since. You know, there's a token in Kyoto and continues under something called LUCF, which you can look up elsewhere, but basically limits the consideration of land use to a very, very small fraction of that 11.5 billion tons that naturally happens. And more recently, there's even some additional program called RED, which tries to tackle the saving the forests in some of the poorer countries, but is very small again and operates on a charity model rather than the business model that it should be. Okay, I want to go to China now. China is by far the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide. It represents 30% of the total. Their emissions, in order to reach a neutral point, would have to reduce by 90+%, and that's simply not going to happen. Since 1990, China's emissions have quadrupled from 2.4 billion tons to 10.4 billion tons. With a similar population, India is following the same trend. They're behind them, but they're following that same trend. China's emissions today are almost double the American, which used to be the leader, and they were less than half of the American emissions in 1990, 30 years ago. Okay, now comparing Canada to China. Our total emissions over that same 10-year period from 06 to 15, Canada's average emissions were 567 million. Sorry, that's million tons for Canada, billion tons. Yeah, okay. And China is 9.64. Now, the 9.64 is the average over the period because China was increasing. It's currently at 10.4 in the latest year. Canada's emissions over that period were stable. So what you see as an average is about what we did in each of the years as well. Now, if you go back, if you take that, again, the amount absorbed by the land, and the countries are roughly the same size, you see that if you reduce by the amount of 770 for the land and 740 for China's land, the remainder to the air and the water then for Canada is a negative number, 200 million tons. And the remainder for China, of course, is a big problem. Now, China and India had the opportunity, could have leapfrogged in their development the old dirty sources of energy. But instead, they chose to take the cheapest, least innovative, dirtiest way forward. And that's what we face. China continues to build and finance coal plants for themselves and across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa with no signs of stopping. Okay? Simply put, climate change does not originate in Canada. climate change is made in China. That's what the numbers say. But they get off scot-free and we get the taxes. Now, our government's decided to levy a carbon tax on Canadians, but there's nothing on our imports from China or anywhere else. If you were to be fair to all Canadians who need to work for a living, then we should at least have a comparable tax on our imports, if you think carbon taxes are the way to go. Okay. Our federal government is going to approach the Chinese on a broad front to improve and increase our trade relations. Our climate policies need to be on the same page as China if we're to expect fair trade. Population. You can't talk about Asia without mentioning population. Overpopulation in the world is the biggest problem. It is the elephant in the climate change room. Okay. Attempts to limit population growth haven't worked, don't work. Most people don't even want to think about it. So we have to be realistic. Population will increase. Okay. Global fossil fuel use has increased at or above the rate of population growth since the 1960s. Multiple organizations, including the International Energy Agency, expect fossil fuel use to grow out to mid-century at 1% a year. That's in line with anticipated population growth. Okay. So as the population grows, demand for fossil fuel will grow. Canada's policies seem totally at odds with that. Okay. The current federal government's strategy for a clean growth economy that they have submitted to the UN as a discussion document proposes that Canada lower its emissions by 80% from current by mid-century. Now, under that scenario, Canada's fossil fuel industry, the biggest driver in our economy, will basically wither and die. Okay. Even as global demand grows. Okay. As all of Canadians sacrifice to lower our emissions, we provide that lower emissions as a free gift to places like China that are uncooperative on the issue and happily exploit every advantage we give them. Now, I always get per capita back as why we should do more, because we are in fact high per capita emitters. But it's a destructive kind of argument for Canada, because CO2 knows no national borders, and it's not the important item. It's what is important is the total. But let's have a run at it anyway. There's our problem. According to the environmental groups, we have CO2 emissions at close to 16 tons per person. China is less than half that. If you subtract out what we absorb, though, on a full cycle, our net absorption, or our emissions, are actually minus. I don't think anybody will ever lay that one out. Certainly not from the environmental group, because they have trouble with the full cycle. We need to stop and realize that Canada is not a major player. No matter how much we punch above our weight, we have no significant influence on climate change from the perspective of emissions. The hard truth is that no country is interested in following our lead, and we have no sway with the big ones that do. Okay. So what can we do? Recommendations. Complete the carbon cycle. The Canadian government should immediately put its best minds to work quantifying our land mass's natural absorption capacity. In addition, our provincial government should publicly challenge the best minds they have at our universities to study the entire cycle from emission to absorption in order to get the balance sheet right. Okay? There is nothing that stops anyone in Canada from doing that now. We don't have to ask anyone's permission to do that. We have an obligation to, and we should get at it. Second action, implement full carbon cycle pricing. If we must, and I say must, I'm not with full agreement with it, but if we must have carbon pricing, then in order to be efficient, to be effective, to know that you're actually doing this thing correctly, you have to price the full cycle, and that means pricing natural absorption. You cannot find an efficient solution without it. At $50 a ton for our absorption based on those calculations, Canada would have $10 billion a year to do environmental things. Okay? And who do we give that away to? China. Okay? We need to harness all the people that use land, our farmers, our foresters, all of the people. They are already on the forefront of some of this stuff. And if they can improve it, they ought to be paid for it. And they ought to be paid for it by people like China. Okay. We need, action 3, we need to create a land conservation and management coalition. We're not alone. Every country should get its fair share. Some of these countries are desperately poor. We need to start with huge places, forest places like Russia, Brazil, Republic of Congo, Argentina, Peru, and organize this side of the equation. Organize this side of the, we shouldn't have to do it alone, and if we do it, you will recognize that we will then in fact protect and preserve the forests that are essential to maintaining any semblance of balance on that carbon cycle. We've lost 30% of the forests already. Another 20% are degraded. And the population of the world is going to overrun the rest if we don't protect them. And the way to do that is with price. Okay. The fourth one is a tough nut for Alberta. You can't get carbon cycle back to balance unless we reduce fossil fuel usage. Okay, that's a hard fact of life. Now, if we're going to do that, it would probably be a more direct approach to approach it from the supply side rather than demand at the pump. So carbon taxes distort markets, so do cartels. But we need to look at that. So Canada could broker a deal with the major players that I call the superpowers. These are the climate superpowers. If you look at those 3 countries for oil, they represent fully a third of the world oil supply. The 2 countries there are more than half of the coal. The natural gas the same, about 40% for the US and Russia. In terms of geography, those 4 countries are about a third of the world's land surface. So if you have those people in the room and they can cooperate to lay out the groundwork for a climate-sensitive production, then you have the makings of a solution to this problem. Okay. Conversely, if these big players won't cooperate, then no amount of taxation on Canadians or behavioral change by Canadians will make any difference at all. Big players will let you know where they stand. Okay. The other defensive issue here for Canada, and particularly Alberta, is if we're not in the room when these decisions get made, we're the ones who have lost production in the oil sands. What share of what market is left, what climate-sensitive market we have, what share of that belongs to Canada and to Alberta, and who's going to defend our interests, all Canadians' interests. So, in conclusion, I believe we need a fair climate policy that acknowledges the importance of the full cycle, carbon sinks as well, that the large polluters, the major polluters need to do the heavy lifting, emitters I should say. I don't believe that there's any point in taxing Canadians when we know that it will not have any effect on global climate change, nor I think is there any reason to handicap our industries with it without the cooperation of the people who actually matter. Okay. Wherever you are on the spectrum of opinion on this issue, please insist that the full cycle of science be completed and be part of the discussion when you're forming your opinions. It's not some arbitrary reduction from some arbitrary date that's the solution here. By getting the credit we deserve, we ensure that the planet's real polluters pay their fair share. We win, and so does the climate. So the question is, why do we let our leaders set us up to fail? I think that the options that I've presented here today offer a stronger, greener Canada in a greener world. Thank you.